So we've spent the last several lessons learning about post-classical Europe, aka medieval Europe, and how after the fall of Rome, European civilizations were kind of in a rut, right? They were stuck with the feudal system. They were dominated by this Catholic Church that was very intolerant of different beliefs. I mean, that part's not going to change. The economy was not good. Kings were weak. There was no long distance trade really to speak of, so no long distance cultural diffusion. Europeans were isolated. They had no idea about all of the riches and goods and technology that were being diffused throughout the Indian Ocean trade networks. And today we're going to be looking at one kind of event, one series of events that began to change the story for Europe. It's not going to change the Christian part of the story or the intolerant part of the story, but it is going to slowly drag Europe's economy out of the feudal system and back into a money-based economy where you can have more tax bases, higher specialization, stuff like that. And it reintroduces Europe to the broader world, which had been doing just great, and to the technologies that had been diffusing throughout the Middle Ages. Those series of events are called the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of wars launched by the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, aimed to get European Christians, to go to Jerusalem, which is in modern-day Israel, Palestine, in the Middle East, which Christians believed was the Holy Land. It's where Jesus came from, very important place in the history of Christianity. Right. And it was a part of the world that had been under Muslim control for quite some time. If you look at the map, the yellow parts of the map were under Muslim control. Jerusalem is towards the right. And the Pope launched these wars, aiming to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christian world. A number of reasons for doing this. One, in terms of religious significance, Jerusalem was important. And the Pope, even though he was among the most powerful people in Europe, if not the most powerful person in Europe, wanted even more power. So there's that. But Jerusalem is also in a part of the world that is, or was, pretty rich. There was a lot to be gained by taking that part of the world in terms of like material goods, money. And so, that was pretty appealing too. The Crusades lasted for years. There were several of them. I think there were 8. None of them were successful. They did not successfully retake Jerusalem. But the consequences of these wars, even though like the actual wars themselves were total failures, ended up being critical to dragging Europe out of the rut that they found themselves in after the fall of Rome. So we're going to start off by just kind of getting ourselves oriented in time. We had the classical period with Rome and ancient Greece and the Han Dynasty and all of that. And then after that comes the post-classical period. In the Middle East and Asia, we saw the rise and expansion of Islam and the Arab Empire. And that civilization experienced a golden age roughly around the years 700 to 1200. During that time, Europe was in a dark age, opposite of a golden age, right? Recovering from the after effects of the fall of Rome. And here we have the rise of the feudal system. In the second half of the Middle Ages, however, things began to change, and that's where we're focusing today. The irony is they change for the better for Europe through 2 pretty objectively terrible events. The first were the Crusades, again, like a series of military campaigns launched by Christian Europe aiming to retake what they considered to be their Holy Land from the people they called heathens and infidels and the unclean Muslims, but actually just people who had been living in that part of the world for quite some time, relatively peacefully. The second was a series of epidemics called the Black Death or the Plague that wiped out roughly 1/3 of the European population. Both of those events end up pulling Europe out of the rut of feudalism and setting Europe up to dominate the globe. But that happens later. Right. During that same time, the second half of the Middle Ages, you have the rise and expansion of the Mongol Empire, which we will get to in a future unit. And then the time period ends roughly around 1492, when Europeans launch the age of exploration and are successful enough in navigating by sea that a guy named Columbus can sail the wrong way to get to India, hit the Americas, not even know it, but, quote unquote, discover a continent that had been inhabited by people for quite some time too. In terms of the two major civilizations that we've covered so far, though, Europe and the Arab Empire, they couldn't be more different. And this really makes a huge difference for the context for these Crusades. Europe, as we've seen, was a very isolated, very superstitious, kind of like small, intolerant, not super great place to live part of the world. The Arab Empire, meanwhile, was enjoying the fruits of long-distance trade along the Indian Ocean and the Trans-Saharan trade network that diffused lots of goods and money, but also technologies that were really important, like gunpowder, like printing, like the compass, like the astrolabe. So, in these Crusades, in this clash, this military clash between Europe and the Muslims in Jerusalem, we have the encounter between a Dark Age culture, so-called, and a Golden Age culture. Let's see what happens. To orient ourselves on the map, the red arrows point to parts of the world that were under Muslim control at the time. When we talk about Jerusalem or the Holy Land, you're thinking about the place on the bottom right of the screen in the east. Muslim Spain will come into play towards the later part of this story too. That's on the left of your screen. The Western European kingdoms roughly are in the region that is circled. They were Catholic, they were headed by the Pope. And there is a place called the Byzantine Empire. That was the eastern half of the Roman Empire that survived the fall. It was also Christian, but it was not led by the Catholic Church. It was led by a different sort of organization for Christianity. You'll also hear reference to a place called Constantinople. There's an arrow pointing to it. It's a really key city, now called Istanbul, that was rich because of its location made it key to trade. Remember, though, that the Muslim world at this point was vast, right? And it included Jerusalem on the right, on the east, and Spain, also called Iberia, in the west. And that sets the stage for the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of religious wars promoted by the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, during the Middle Ages in Europe, aimed at taking the area around Jerusalem, which he called the Holy Land, for the Christian world, Christendom, from the Muslims who had been there since roughly the year 638, so quite some time. The First Crusade wouldn't have been, 400 or 500 years after that. The Pope not only wanted to retake this part of the world because it was religiously significant, but also because of the increased wealth and prestige that would come if they succeeded. The church was already powerful, but it would have been like super duper mega powerful had the Crusades worked. The Crusades did not succeed. Europe was in no position to conquer anything at the time. But the unintended effects of the Crusades were hugely important for history, as often happens, for a number of reasons. One that I'd like to put in your heads early, though, is this idea of holy war. A holy war is a war that is launched for religious purposes, and the people who are fighting it believe that they have the sanction of their God on their side. Their God says it's okay to fight these wars. This can make these kinds of wars extra violent, because what you get is an idea that no matter what you do, no matter how violent you are towards the enemy, your God says it's good and right for you to kill that enemy. It's your ticket to heaven. And that's no good. The idea that it's good to kill non-Christians, that God wants you to do it, that doing so is playing out God's work on earth or whatever. that's going to have like a pretty horrible historical legacy, not just for the Crusades, but in terms of how Christian Europe treats other people that they conquer in history later. This gets us to another big theme in history that is worth learning early, because it'll make sense of your world, like always, if you keep an eye on it. And it's the distinction between material reasons to do something and ideological justifications for those actions. Material reasons to do something refer to like what somebody has to gain tangibly by doing it. What's in it for you, right? For the Crusades, there was a lot of money in and around the Holy Land, and that was a huge motivation to go fight these wars. Usually people don't talk about the reasons for doing things in terms only of what's in it for them. It makes people sound pretty selfish and it's hard to justify. So often you'll get a lot more talk relating to ideological justifications, which relate to the ideas or beliefs that allow people to commit acts that harm other people and still consider themselves to be the good guys of the story. Because people tend not to think of themselves as the bad guys in the story, right? These are the rationalizations, the justifications. For the Crusades, these wars were pitched as a holy war. It was God's will to reclaim the Holy Land, and that's what people relied on to, tell themselves that they were doing the right thing. This is something that like applies to history. Every time you see a war, anytime there's a conflict, you'll usually see the people who are instigating this conflict talk mostly about ideological justifications. Like, we're going to go invade Iraq to spread democracy, whatever. Often they don't discuss directly the material reasons, which often have a lot more to do with actually making them act, right? Like there's a lot of oil in Iraq and we want it. This is a thing that doesn't just apply to history, though. It's a part of human psychology that it's always worth keeping an eye on for yourself just as much for other people. Sometimes it's called the moralization gap. We tend to justify our own behavior and morally judge other people's behavior. So we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, and we don't really do that for other people. When we do something that accidentally causes somebody harm, usually we'll talk about our intentions. I didn't mean to, right? I was trying to do this other thing. When other people do things that cause us harm, we usually don't focus so much on like their justifications. We usually focus on what they were trying to gain. So another overlap between history and life. The Crusades themselves were multiple. The first one began in 1096. There were like 8. The 8th one didn't end until 1396. All of them failed to capture Jerusalem. In the long run anyway, although they did get into the city and, were super violent while they were there, as you will read in some primary sources. So having failed to rescue the Holy Land from the Muslims in the East, Crusaders then turned their eyes to the West, to Spain, and set their sights on reconquering Iberia, which refers to Spain and Portugal. In this process, Europeans kind of solidified this habit of thinking of the difference between civilized people and barbarians in terms of religious faith. The Catholics are civilized, everybody who isn't is a barbarian, and that gave them license to treat non-Catholics in kind of inhuman ways. Another good thing to keep your eye on in history. In terms of the Reconquista in Spain, the reconquering of Spain from the Muslims, it was a long process, beginning around the 700s, ending, key date, 1492. And in this quest to reconquer Spain from the Arabs, Europeans were successful. Although Spain had been under Muslim control for years, and as we saw when we looked at Cordoba, had been a multicultural kingdom with religious tolerance, at least relatively for the time, creating this like highly advanced medieval civilization. In the Reconquest, the Catholics expelled all Jews and Muslims from Spain. It allowed people to convert to Catholicism, but then sometimes it tested that conversion with torture. That torture is known to history as the Spanish Inquisition, which was a campaign of making Spain what they called pure, Catholic. In expelling or killing all the Muslims and Jews from the country, Catholics removed Spain's developing middle class. They took a place that was like multicultural and pretty advanced and made it smaller, more provincial, meaner, really. Ended the policy of religious toleration that had existed there. And then, when the Spanish Inquisition ended in 1492, they took that same religious fervor to the Americas with Columbus that very same year. And then the natives of the Americans became victims of this kind of intolerance and campaign to get like religious purity. Feel free to look up the Spanish Inquisition on your own time. It's a trip, not a good one. That brings us to the Crusades, right? Why are we talking about all these wars that failed? Well, because their effects were tremendous for Europe. The Crusades, the campaign to retake the Holy Land, was militarily unsuccessful for Europe, but the long-term effects were huge. First, a lot of violent people went to fight the Crusades, and so, during the Crusades, Europe itself became a slightly less violent place, which allowed it to recover a bit. Second, it was the first time in a long, long time that people in Europe had traveled to distant lands. In doing so, they saw evidence of all of that cultural diffusion they'd been missing out on through the Indian Ocean trade. All that technology, the riches, the goods, the spices, gunpowder, and they wanted in. As cultural diffusion begins to penetrate Europe, around 1262-ish, Europe begins to change. Importantly, this transfer was almost exclusively one way from the Muslim world to Western Europe. Europeans learned a ton from the Muslim world. It didn't really work the other direction. One of the things they learned is that long-distance trade is good and they should be doing it. So trade begins to make a comeback in Europe. And with trade comes cities. So cities began to develop more. With cities and trade come a middle class and a money economy. So instead of just focusing on trading land for services and protection, you have like coins that make a comeback. A money economy means taxes can be different, right? So you can like levy taxes on a bigger scale, and taxes can pay for things like nicer cities, nicer roads, boats to go explore, for example. All of this led to the Age of Exploration, where Europeans saw the need to get to the Indian Ocean trade network, because that's where all of the riches were coming from. And they had to do it without crossing Muslim lands because they just made a bunch of enemies by fighting the Crusades. So they had to go by sea. And in that process, we get to Columbus sailing the wrong direction, hitting Americas, thinking it was India, but it wasn't, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of longer term effects, these conflicts as a religious war were viewed radically differently by the two parties involved. Catholics believed that they were fighting the Crusades in the name of their God. Jesus was born in Jerusalem, and Catholics viewed that area as a holy land, and they felt they had the duty to retake this place of his birth from people they called infidels or heathens, like the unfaithful, people who aren't Catholic and who we therefore demonize. For Catholics, the Crusades were a justified holy war then. This also gets you the idea that fighting in these wars gives you a direct ticket to heaven, and so these were super violent, and it wasn't just violent, it was violence that people were able to justify to themselves, and that sets a legacy for a whole history of religiously justified violence that isn't going to stop after the post-classical period. So Catholics thought they were right. They should go invade these places. Muslims, though, had a very different view of this conflict because they were just living where they had been living for hundreds of years. And then they saw the Crusaders as immoral, bloody, savage invaders. Muslims thought they were defending land that was theirs. And the ruthless and widespread massacre of Muslims, Jews, and other non-Christians in these conflicts resulted in bitter resentment that persisted for many years and to this day. Even today, you'll see commonly in the news when the West is involved in the Middle East, see that as a crusade. So that brings us to our key points, which we've covered in the previous slides. Feel free to go ahead and pause the video here and jot down a summary of the key points that you see on the screen. Now we're going to go a little deeper though. So like here's a map to refresh your memory about where everything is. Remember too, there's a big difference between a material reason for doing something, what you have to gain, and an ideological justification for it, like the system of beliefs that creates a permission structure for often violent acts. And we're going to look at a primary source that we have access to from the year 1095. It's Pope Urban II's call to crusades. So like the speech that he gave to try to get people in Western Europe to go really far out of their way to go fight people that weren't a direct threat to them because it would have benefited him. So I've got the text on the slide, and in the little banners on the right, I have my that the world is. You have to take these with a grain of salt. So he says, "O people of Franks," the French, right? "People chosen and beloved by God, set apart from all nations by the location of your country and by your Catholic faith." Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Hey, French people who are special because you're Catholic. We wish you to know what a grievous cause has led us to your country, what peril threatening you and all the faithful have brought us here. So he's saying that there's a direct threat to you, French people, and I'm going to tell you about. Paragraph 2, he talks about people who are really far away, from the confines of Jerusalem and the city of Constantinople, which, if you'll remember, is pretty far away from Western Europe. But okay. A horrible tale has gone forth, namely, that a people from the kingdom of the Persians, so Muslims, an accursed people, a people utterly alienated from God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire. It has led away a part of their captives in their country, and a part it has destroyed by cruel torture. It has destroyed the churches of God or appropriated them for the rites of their own religion. They destroy altars, they defile them with their uncleanliness. They circumcise Christians, and the blood of the circumcision they either spread upon the altars or pour into the basin of the baptismal font, and it goes on like this. That wasn't true, but it certainly serves to dehumanize the enemy, right? Like these Muslim people that the Europeans wouldn't have had direct contact with ever. Probably not the people who are listening to the speech anyway. So basically saying, I want you to go fight this war. Let me start by persuading you by dehumanizing the enemy who is really, really far away and who isn't actually a direct threat to you. So in order to get people to go fight this war, he needs to make them seem really evil. And he certainly does that in paragraph 2. Feel free to like pause the video and read all the details about intestines and flogging and stuff. Next, he gives Europeans the impression that they alone can stop this thing that's happening to the Byzantine Empire, which is between Western Europe and this Holy Land. Long story short is the Byzantine Empire was having a hard time with its Muslim neighbors. They were fighting, and the Pope's saying, like, we need to go fix this. Because if not you, then who? Because you're the Christian army in any way. Your ancestors did amazing things, so you should too. Feel free to pause the video and read the slide here. All right, here we get into the material reasons to go fight these wars, right? Like what's in it for you tangibly? First, if you are hindered by love of your family, wives, etc., remember that the Lord says in the gospel, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Everyone that has forsaken a house or brethren or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and shall inherit everlasting life. In other words, if you go fight these wars, you go to heaven. Don't let your possessions detain you, he continues, because this land that you inhabit is shut in by the sea and surrounded by mountains. It's too narrow for your large population, and it's not very wealthy. So there's not really enough food to go around, and that's why you guys murder and devour one another, that you wage war, that you frequently perish by mutually inflicted wounds. In other words, he's saying like Europe isn't rich enough to sustain our population, and that's why you guys have been fighting with each other for the last several hundred years. So don't let like any attachment to the place you're from keep you from going to fight this war that I want you to fight. Speaking of which, that war that I want you to fight, he continues, I'm still paraphrasing, is in Jerusalem, which is the navel of the world, the center of the world. It's a fruitful land. It's a paradise of delights. There's lots of riches here, is what he's saying. So go on this journey for remission of your sins so you can go to heaven. And because it's rich and your land isn't, and this little war will fix that problem. To conclude, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but you can pause the slide here if you'd like to. But he reiterates this idea that this is a holy war. This work is given to you by God. When an armed attack is made upon the enemy, let this one cry be raised by all soldiers of God. It is the will of God. So in other words, your God is cool with like this whole violent thing that I'm asking you to do. Then he asks people who aren't good at fighting to not come, which is kind of funny. And then he reiterates that if you are good at fighting, though, God says you have to do this. So, good times with primary sources. Finally, a little extra for those of you who are actually super interested in this. The effects on the Crusades on Europe were a little bit more complicated than I went over in the initial note-taking part of the video, so feel free to pause the video here and look at the complicated part. And finally, not that this is the point or anything, but I like Robin Hood. Do you like Robin Hood? If you want to understand the context of Robin Hood, it's the Crusades. Evil King John is only evil King John because the good king went off to fight in the Crusades. Okay, done.